Okay. Welcome to NobleWarrior. If you can hear us, go ahead and type in on the side that we can hear you so we know that we are live. Okay. Welcome to NobleWarrior. This is a place where entrepreneurs talk about what it takes to create and scale purpose-driven organizations. We're going to talk about mindset. We're going to talk about mental models. We're going to talk about actionable tactics such that you can take everything that you learn and go out and create and scale your purpose organization. My name is CK Lin, biomedical engineering PhD from UCLA that turned startup executive. That was part of a founding team, went from an idea to a 9-figure plus company, 200 plus employees that turned executive coach, focusing on helping entrepreneurs, founders around their mindset and culture. My next guest is a pioneer in humanitarian architecture. He's a former co-founder of Architecture for Humanity, director of Jolie-Pitt Foundation, head of social innovation for Airbnb. Currently, the founder of Frontline Care that brings shelters solutions to take care of frontline healthcare workers. Please welcome Cameron Sinclair.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Cameron. Really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy.
This is the first time I've done one of these from in the middle of the woods. So I feel like it's going to be an experience for both of us.
Amazing. I love it. So why don't I actually start off from the founding stories of Architecture for Humanity. Can you tell us that story real quick? You know, the time where you called the UN?
Well, there's the short version, which is the UN version, but then there's the origins of that founding thing, and we can talk about that later. But you know, back in 1999, I happened to be designing buildings in Romania as an architect and working for an architecture firm, and at the same time, Kosovo was happening, and hundreds of thousands of people being forced from their homes into Albania and Montenegro. And my graduate thesis was about how to house people in a transitional and temporary way. And I kind of felt that as a young designer, I had a moral and ethical obligation to help the community that I'm in. And the community I happened to be in were being displaced. And that my entire graduate work was about how to help displaced people. So I was kind of like, this is what I was built to do. And I have, you know, as a global designer, I have a responsibility to figure out how I can support and help those who are being displaced. Two important things happened that particular year. One was called Google, and the other was called eternal optimism, which is, for whatever reason, I ended up embracing this idea of being internally optimistic and believing the possible. And so I went into Google and I typed United Nations, refugees, Kosovo, New York, and up popped a phone number for the UNHCR's offices. And I called the number and I said, I'm a designer. I have this idea about how to house people in a 5 to 10 year timeline during and post conflict. And I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of refugees. And the guy on the phone said, well, that's kind of me. What do you want? And so I pitched him the full idea, and he said, this is remarkable for 2 reasons. 1, you're the first architect to call this office in years. And 2, it's a pretty good idea. And so could you come to the office and could you present your idea with your firm? But back then I was in my early 20s. I didn't have a firm. I just had a bunch of buddies that we used to drink with. And so I said, listen, I'll buy you all beers if you pretend to be a firm and come to the UN with me. And so we went to the UN with white shirts and black trousers and black ties, thinking that's what architects should look like. And we presented this idea. And I was very passionate about the idea of internally displaced refugees, people that were stuck in their own country, couldn't have shelter in a country that didn't have the resources to support them. And at the time, the UN didn't deal with internally placed refugees. They didn't even document them. And so they said, well, listen, we can't help you, but here are a bunch of organizations that can. And so I began to pursue the idea of supporting these internally displaced refugees. And I called up the editor of an architecture magazine, a guy called Robert Ivy, who's now the head of the American Institute of Architects. And by the way, the guy who picked up the phone at the UN was a guy called Andreas Gutierrez, who's now the Secretary General of the UN. And so, these things happen. And so Robert Ivy, I told him this idea. I said, I'm a young designer. I have this idea. I have these contacts in Kosovo and Montenegro and Albania, and I want to be able to do this housing solution. And if I do it, could you publish it? Because I think it's important to have this conversation about the role of the architect. And his response was, well, actually, who cares? To be honest, you're not actually helping anyone. You're just really helping yourself. And architects don't really want to help other people. They have clients and they get hired and they build the buildings. And he was just trying to antagonize me. I didn't know that at the time, but he wanted to just see how passionate I was about this idea.
He was testing you.
Yeah, he was testing me. He just wanted to say, was I some young kid looking for some publishing, something in a magazine? And by the end of the phone call, which was laden with quite a few expletives, because I was getting very passionate about my feelings towards architecture, I slammed the phone down and I said, I bet there are hundreds of architects that want to help. And that night, I, got the Architecture for Humanity website. We started a competition to design housing for returning refugees. And we launched what was going to be a design competition called Architecture for Humanity. My co-founder, Kate Storr, and I kind of helped put it together. She was from the tech world, so she helped me with the tech side. I was from the design world. But what happened is rapidly, because we were one of the first websites that dealt with architecture and social good, we grew exponentially. And we ended up responding to dozens of issues, and then hundreds, and then dozens of natural disasters, then hundreds of projects. And within 15 years, we grew to the size where we had tens of thousands of pro bono architects willing to offer their services, and dozens of projects happening simultaneously around the world.
So thank you for sharing that origin story. I want to dive in a little bit deeper, more on the beginning side of things. So in the beginning was naivete, right? You just didn't know.
Yeah.
And then instead of following the old model, that is, let me start from the bottom, middle management, and then eventually talk to the decision maker. I love that you just went, who can I call from the top? And you just went directly to the top.
Yeah. But I didn't really even know there was a middle management, right? It was just the luck of being able to have the right person pick up the phone. And instead of saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to call you, let me talk to somebody else, I just pitched, right? I didn't know about pitching. I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship then. I just said, I have this idea, I have to get it out.
So backtrack for a moment, because I'm looking at what you've accomplished, your resume, so to speak. You develop shelter solutions, you develop schools for refugee children, you develop mobile HIV or now COVID health centers, you develop cultural sustainability and preservation projects. And that, in my mind, went way beyond my definition of architects. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what's your definition of architecture.
So that takes me back earlier, because I feel like I was duped into being an architect.
Okay.
I grew up in a very rough part of East London. There was a lot of violence. There was no trees. There wasn't this sort of surrounding. It wasn't a peaceful place. And as a young kid, I used to run away from home all the time. And I wasn't running away to get away from my parents, but I was curious about other neighborhoods in London. And so by the time I was 6, 7, 8 years old, I was basically going to other parts of London by myself and understanding that different urban environments resulted in different outcomes. A nice park, a well-formatted, gathering place. People were happy and they smiled. And at the time, I didn't know it was socioeconomic reasons, right? Because when you're poor, you don't think you're poor. You think your neighbor's poor, right? So no one actually said, well, Cameron, you guys come from a poor household and you live in a rough neighborhood. That's why it's so bad. I was like, why is this architecture better? And so as a 6-year-old or 7-year-old, I thought, maybe if you build better architecture, you could actually improve communities. And so I became an architect because I felt that it was a vessel where people discover how to become better humans. And that as we put things into the world, we're not just affecting the client, we're affecting everybody in that ecosystem. So when you're building, something in the middle of a city, it's not just the owner of that building, it's everybody that surrounds that building that gets affected by either positively or negatively. So by the time I went to architecture school, I was absolutely convinced that that's what the role of the architect was to either positively improve the planet or to be a detriment. And I wanted to make sure that I was going to positively improve the planet. So it's kind of, it's not.
Yeah, I think you said it so beautifully, because as an engineer, as a systems thinker, I always, before going big, I try my best to think about the atomic unit of whatever it is I'm building, right? So what you just said is architecture, or is the vessel to be better humans. So that's, for you, the atomic unit of anything that you build. So within that framework, then you can build something as small as like a building, to all the way to mobile hospitals and units. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, and the other part of that is I feel that architecture has many authors. There's the physical architect, there's the actual person who does the drawing. But to get a building to be built takes so many people, right? I mean, I'm right next to a house here up in upstate New York. It wasn't an architect that created this house. There were engineers, there were builders, there were community members. There were, this was an old farmhouse. So there was a farmer who cared about how the setup of his house was going to look. And so had some influence in the solution. There was materials that were of the time, construction methodologies of the time that created this piece of architecture. And so it's a culmination of a lot of things and a very collaborative process to create the solution. And so, I've always been a big proponent of very collaborative solutions where, anything that you do, CK, anything you personally do, and this is talking directly to you, everyone loves the idea of having their name attached to it. But for me, the most beautiful thing is that in generations, people will see an idea or a solution and it will just bring delight or joy or happiness or just improve their standing. And they don't know who the name behind that is, but it turns out it's you. And so it's almost like you're paying your empathy forward. And that as someone who's an innovator or an entrepreneur, instant gratification doesn't work, because then your value proposition is different. Then you say, I need a solution in the next 6 months because I want to win a Fast Company award, or like, I need to get my idea out by next month because there's some accelerator program that's going to give me $50,000 to do. Like, if you figure out short-term solutions and short-term results, you have a short-term mindset. And so if you can think multi-generational, that your solution will exist, then you've made impact, because it's about multi-generational impact.
I love that. Thank you for that. So when you think about a solution, you think in terms of intergenerational solution. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, so by the way, you don't notice, but on NobleWarrior, we talk a lot about the body, the mind, the heart, and the spirit as well. So we use spiritual terms kind of interchangeably. Hope you don't mind. So the idea is, how do I articulate it? Right. So our intention is to build intergenerational solutions. At the same time, we also live in this material world, right? We do have budgetary constraints, time constraints, and the ecosystem that we play with. So in my mind, it's the yin and the yang, right? There's the intention that we want to build, as well as the constraints that we have. So when you think about you, Cameron, speaking to you directly now, when you think about solutions and problems, do you think in terms of, let's say some Japanese corporation, they think in terms of 200 years out. So that's them. So when you think about it, what do you have like a rubric on? Okay, let's think about what level is, what extent, what's the boundary of your responsibilities? Probably that's a better way to phrase it.
Yeah, I mean, well, what's weird about it is that a lot of my history and my work has been in crisis and disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So the solution has been needed now. But conceptually, the idea should last way beyond that particular incident. And so, I can just think of a myriad. I mean, it's funny you talked about spirit. When I was in Japan and we were rebuilding after the tsunami, we had a whole process where we were talking about reusing material that was found. And a lot of the families said, in the kind of collaborative design process, that we really had to be careful about the materials that were used because some of the materials came from homes and the spirits of their ancestors occupied their homes. So they wanted to make sure that that material was used in the correct way, right? As somebody who's like doing resource management, like that's not in your equation process. So I think you have to kind of figure out like, people have different values behind things. And so you have to take a very broad-minded approach, even if like, the pragmatists are just like, we need materials, here's some materials, let's go do this, right? So you have to balance those two. For me, long after I'm gone, I'll be happy. I mean, it's even happening now. I mean, almost, you mentioned about the mobile health clinics. So, almost 20 years ago, we proposed the idea of doing mobile health clinics to combat HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Rapid testing, all the things that are actually like in parallel to the COVID-19 crisis here in the US and elsewhere. At that time, I adopted the idea of open sourcing technology and the ability to share and distribute that and working with Creative Commons. And because of that work, actually putting a kind of Creative Commons open source license on the mobile clinics, we ended up getting the TED Prize, right? Which is like, it was at the time a very big deal. And for us, I thought it was a person. I didn't even know it was a conference, right? I thought it was a guy called Ted giving prizes, right? And so, my co-founder and I, when we did that, we ended up doubling down in the kind of open source world for architecture. But fast forward 20 years, I've met people that have said, hey, you've got really awesome ideas. You should go give a TED talk, right? Like there's been such separation between, like, there was a moment in my life where there was a lot of attention and honor paid to the work we did. And I was very fortunate and thankful for that moment in time. But now we've gone so far beyond that's history. And and for many people who are young practitioners, they actually don't even know this history that I had 20 years ago. So it's not just intergenerational. It's almost kind of, once you start doing the same thing for multiple decades, it's an evolution of thought. And you have to remember that some people weren't along the beginning of the journey. They're just meeting you at a certain point in your journey. So sometimes it's in the now. But to be honest, my timeline, I would probably say is 50 to 100 years is a basic, like another lifetime beyond me. That like the day I pass away, that someone could be born the next day. And at some point in the future, they might discover something that I worked on. Like that to me is a success. If it's somebody who just like, read a book that we did, that's great. And it inspires them, but it hasn't made the impact that that idea should have made.
I mean, that's actually one of the reasons why that inspired me to start this podcast in the first place. Because I have, really smart conversations with smart, motivated, very accomplished individuals all the time. And sometimes I felt like, wow, it would have been really great if we had recorded that. And now in perpetuity can help others who are thinking about humanitarian architecture or, grappling with their own internal self-doubt and things like that. So,
yeah.
So with that said, one of the things that I walk away from my personal work is, wow, a ceremonial work is like, man, it's challenging enough to be a human in this, living in this reality. And I have a huge admiration for people who want to take on other people's challenges, like nurses, doctors, therapists. But looking at you and the body of work that you've done, you when disasters happen, most people say, all right, let me be as far away as possible. You run into the disaster with your laptop and designs and trying to help. So I'm curious to know, what did that desire come from? And one of the things we say on this podcast quite a lot is our superpower comes from our biggest wounds. So were there something in the past that inspired you, that happened, that inspired you to say, hey, when someone is in need, I'm going to help to the best of my ability? Is there any stories like that?
Yeah, I mean, and something I should mention about the idea of people that are frontline workers is there's a lot of trauma and PTSD around people that do frontline work a lot, which is why I started, frontline care. And even for humanitarian designers, I think like our personal lives are very challenged. We end up making mistakes in the areas that everyday people are careful not to. So, that's something to consider too, because, you lose perspective. But in terms of a personal story, so my sister and I are almost the same age, almost identical. She's 10, 11 months older than me, as we like to say, Irish twins. And, she was born with a very severe case of type 1 diabetes.
Mm.
And she ended up in hospital probably a couple of months a year. And her doctor at the time said that she had a year to live. And the next year they said she had a year to live. And as a result, and quite naturally, my parents spent a lot of time and attention and care on her and gave me kind of a lot of leeway to do what I want. But it was almost like in our house, there was always a conversation of finality. There was, and the fact that, like, and I'm sure a lot of people that watch this or, have somebody in their life that, gets a terminal illness or has a very tragic accident or has something that is really a shock, right? And it shocks everybody and everyone rallies around. But when you have someone who's so close to you and your family that is always on the edge of not making it, you come to terms with that and you begin to realize that, like, there are bigger issues at play and you're very thankful for the time you had. And, when I started working in disasters, I began to recognize similar attributes in people that are going through a crisis, where they were actually much more resilient than almost anybody else I've met. I mean, I was in New York during 9/11, and folks who were downtown and in Manhattan had a much stronger resilience than people that were outside the city, because their perception of the disaster was so great and they couldn't process it. Whereas when you're in it, you kind of say, okay, this is the new normal. We have to live in this, right? And here's how we're going to respond. And, I have a million stories of, like, during the tsunami of 2004 in Indonesia, I met a couple that asked me about designing a house. And they were two people who had lost every member of their family except a couple of kids. They'd lost their spouses. And the housing for people were very basic, like a very basic wood box or metal box. But there wasn't a nuanced approach to housing for new families. And these two people, through this disaster, had fallen in love. They didn't know each other, but they had a shared situation. They had a shared trauma, which they had lost their spouses and they were trying to raise their kids. They didn't have a job. And all they were asking me as an architect to do was to design them a place where they can come together and be a new family. That is not in the humanitarian design book, right? There's no, like, but what you find is, like, there's such incredible resilience in this space that, the real vulnerabilities are the people like us, the workers, the ones that don't see the blind spots. And so,
can you say more about that? Unpack that for me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you do is, I mean, you're seeing this with COVID-19 right now. You know, I've spent a lot of time talking to frontline workers, doctors, nurses, other professionals that have been working in medical situations and their amount of self-care is almost minimal. Every doctor I know is working extra shifts. Every doctor is like dealing with a Band-Aid solution. They're not going home and seeing their families because they don't want to infect their families. So they're sleeping in a cot bed, right? They're not figuring out, they're pushing themselves to the brink. There are things that are coming down the pipeline here in the United States. There are salary cuts for medical workers that are coming. These were pre-arranged before, right? This isn't like a surprise. Like they're going to start having medical cuts. There are closures of hospitals, there's closures of clinics. So you imagine someone who's worked tirelessly to save lives for 6 months suddenly loses their job. Like, because they did a bad job, but because the system was already in place to eradicate their job. The amount of PTSD and issues that are going to affect these people is going to be astronomical. And we're not setting aside any funding for them. We're just like, let's find a cure. Not and I can tell you, every doctor I've worked with has said, there's no way I'm telling anybody how I'm really feeling. Because I'm not the person who's suffering. And I'm like, you are, you are the person who's suffering because you're burdening the weight and the stress of everybody else on you. And so, you know, and this happens to people that build in disaster. This happens to anybody who's in service and crisis. And we, you know, we tend to, and I did it myself. Like I think probably about 7 years ago, I just was at my lowest. It was just unrelenting amount of work. I was traveling 200,000 to 300,000 miles a year. I was going from disaster to disaster. I had staff who needed to get paid. I had funders who wanted project. Like it was just unrelenting. And then, you know, I left my organization and I kind of, you know, had to kind of reboot. And, you know, it was a tough thing to walk away from in a tough time in the history of the organization. But, you know, I was definitely at my lowest, and I learned a lot in that time period about, like the blind spots that I had allowed to grow within me. And so, you know, when I see disasters, I see.
Do you mind sharing with us what you learned, if it's not too personal, some of the things that you could share with us?
Sure. I mean, like, I think, you know, there's a range of things of not realizing how unhappy I was in certain situations, how I was burdening myself with almost everybody else's problems, how I was not treating people, like, I'm going to give you an appalling example. This is an appalling example, right? I was in one disaster and I was helping rebuild some villages. These villages have been devastated. You know, there were images that will be seared into my mind for the rest of my life, like things that you shouldn't have to see. And then I was on my way back to the States, and I happened to come to New Orleans and the Gulf Coast to meet with some folks around Hurricane Katrina. And when I got down there, it was quite a while after the flooding, so the water had receded, and we were looking at it. And in my mind, I was like, it's not actually that bad. Like my mind had almost corrected itself in what is loss, and it was almost kind of saying, well, how do I prioritize who needs help? And you know, for me, that was that's a big blind spot when you basically have this unconscious bias about prioritize need, and you stop doing the things that you were just part of your DNA, which is understanding what is the real issues on the ground, what are the pre-existing problems that created the disaster, Like a disaster isn't just a natural event. It's when a natural event hits a pre-existing condition.
Correct.
And with Katrina, it was a hurricane hitting deep poverty and racial inequity. And so, you know, I had to course correct. And when I course corrected, I overly course corrected, right? Because I was like, it shook me up. I was like, okay, I got to do something. And I became much more of a angry activist about issues rather than being a compassionate doer. And so I had to course correct back. So I think it's like understanding your own flaws. And I've had many over the years. And I think it's taken a few events in my life to, like, you know, be more real with understanding my vulnerabilities. And also the other thing to note is, as you go through life, you really get to understand who is in your court and who is, you know, they're more interested in the drama or the, you know, being a part of an issue than actually a part of the solution. So, you know, that's been a real interesting life lesson of, like, who is actually there for you and who's willing to be compassionate and as empathetic with what you're going through as you have been with other people. And that's something I missed as well, is that, like, actually even last night someone said, like, people don't know 98% of the stuff you actually do that's good because you don't tell anyone. And the 2% they do know, they question it. And so, you know, it keeps you silent, you know, about things that you're doing. And you know this because we're on, like, WhatsApp threads where we're busy trying to help other people and saying, like, connect and do this. And you end up, you know, like yourself, trying to interconnect lots of people to get good stuff done, none of which has your name attached to it. You're just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you for sharing that, my friend. There's so many things I can say about that, but let me continue on with the thread of the conversation, if you don't mind. One thing that I think one thing that we do talk about on the podcast quite a lot is it's a life is a journey, right? You got the highest of highs and lowest of lows. And part of the journey on the lowest of lows is to embrace, you know, our biggest wounds, right? Such that it's integrated, such that we can then teach other people the lessons as you have just done with us here. So one thing I do actually am curious about is, what is the source of your courage? You know, when I say courage, I mean, you know, even just with your physical well-being, running into a disaster zone. So as a one component. Another component is the courage to speak up, and knowing that others, critics, people who are jealous, are gonna now look at you as a target potentially, right? So what's the source of your courage such that you're willing to do the difficult thing, the challenging thing?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, you know, the source of my challenge, of my courage, is also a challenge, which is I do have a level of stubbornness when somebody doesn't believe in me. And so, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this. And actually, the more vocal someone comes out about how they think you're going to fail at something, or how you think it's stupid, or they think it's inappropriate, or you should just keep quiet, the more you're willing to speak out. I have a couple of interesting examples. So at the time with Architecture for Humanity, my co-founder and I felt that there was an award that was being given primarily to male architects, and they weren't recognizing some of the female partners or the female architects in the field. And so we spoke out about it. And our board of directors formally reprimanded us for weighing into a subject that had nothing to do with our organization. And it was just basically like, you guys just keep quiet about this, right? And so, you know, rather than shut up, we just became more vocal about it, because it almost became like a question of, like, why would you silence someone for speaking up against this particular issue? I also felt strongly about architects being somewhat culpable in the human rights violations that were happening around the world with large-scale development. And the fact that I knew, based on some research and some documentation I had done, of certain architects who had unknowingly allowed there to be human trafficking in the construction of their buildings. And I wanted to have a very open and honest conversation about the fact that we as an industry are culpable in the trafficking of humans, right? Like, we always focus on, say, sex trafficking, but there's many forms of human trafficking. And when I did that, that ended up becoming a source of debate, and people got very divided about it, and certainly put a target on my back. And it was kind of a surprise, rather than us having a frank, honest conversation about it, having, you know, architects becoming incredibly defensive. So I think it's I don't know. I think you have a belief mechanism, and when you get questioned in that belief mechanism and you're willing to back down, maybe you didn't have that belief in the first place.
Yeah.
Maybe it was just an idea that you were exploring.
Yeah, I love to use Mike Tyson's quote. Everyone thinks they have a plan until they get punched in the face. Our adversity reveals our true character, right? As well as our strength, as well as our weaknesses, as well as our light, as well as our shadow. So
yeah,
we don't really know until we're challenged, as you said.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, because you care, you had said earlier, even during your college days, high school days even, you said, I'm a global citizen, I'm a global architect. I care about the world. That's very extraordinary. Most people think in terms of the self, the egoic self first and foremost, and then they'll extend to their family unit, maybe their community, maybe their company, maybe their city, state, nation. Very, very few people think or act on the global level. So I think part of the, let's see if I were to ask this question. When we operate from things that's outside of our sphere of influence, it feel very daunting, because that's, you know, I'm not capable of doing or executing this vision that I have. Whereas you already, you know, jump both feet in on the global level, even though you were a high school or college student. So tell us a little bit about how you kind of grapple with that internally.
I was going to say, I'll just let these guys go past. They're going for a walk.
Sure.
So you might want to repeat the question, as I was being distracted by my dog.
Of course, of course. See if I can ask the question in a more clean way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of the challenge is a lot of people feel so much, they care about the world.
Yeah.
But
okay, so I got that question. Sorry, I just needed to so I had an answer, and then I had a small dog come and distract me. This is what happens when you interview someone in the wilderness. No one ever once told me that we weren't interconnected. I never had. I was never, you know, you teach your kids things, and no one ever taught me that I come first, and that I was always told that we live in a very interconnected world, and what we do over here affects things over here. And so I wasn't, you know, I didn't grow up in the smartest household or like the most well-read, you know, family, but there was a sense that we're all kind of in this together, and we have to figure out a way to move forward. And, you know, Sometimes we're going to have a very tight, close family that helps that happen. Your family is a much broader spectrum of people. And even now, I think my closest friends live in a much more global perspective, because I've ended up attracting, and I've also found kinship in people that also think very similarly. So I don't know. I think it's funny. I was on a call a couple of weeks ago where the theme of the call was why being selfish is better for everybody. It was like the premise of the call.
Sure.
And the speaker was trying to explain why putting yourself first eventually helps other people. But he prefaced that by saying, without being deeply competitive. So he actually negated his entire argument, because, the part about being selfish and putting yourself first is about creating a competition between you and everything else around you. The moment you say, look, we're not in a competitive landscape, we're figuring out how to work collaboratively, you're not being selfish. So I kind of feel like people are, they're made to feel guilty for not putting themselves first, right? That shouldn't be the default. You shouldn't apologize for putting your fellow man at an equal level, And so I don't know. I just haven't come from a society or from a community or a culture where, certainly, again, this plays into the downside, and being so giving is sometimes you don't capitalize on the opportunities you have. So yeah. I know over the last decade, 2 decades, I could have made a lot of money.
You certainly could.
And most people don't realize, like, for instance, with Architecture for Humanity, I used to charge for speaking fees. It used to be a big thing in the architecture industry. People get really upset with me. The fact I had CAA as an agent, and they were charging, 5-figure fees for me to go and give speeches. But what most people didn't know, and I never explained publicly because I felt like I didn't have to do that, was 100% of that money was donated to run the organization, right? And it was 5-fold of even 10-fold of what my salary was certain years. And it covered a lot of people's salaries that I felt were important to be a part of the organization. That wasn't a selfless act. That was an act of saying, okay, there's a mechanism for me to make money. I can even put it in my bank account, but the thing that I really believe in and care about would end up suffering and choking. And then my purpose wouldn't be fulfilled. So I'm going to take this and put it over here. But I'm not going to tell people, because it's like, then you muddy the waters of the why, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, it was much better just to be like, okay, this is, the only people that really knew was the COO and the accountants, right? That like all this money was just being diverted into the organization to help underwrite things. So, over the course of 10 years, that was close to $1.5 million that I decided not to give myself. The TED Prize, I decided not to give myself, right? And it wasn't out of being selfless. I think there were selfish reasons I did it, but the selfish reasons were to allow the collective to grow. So it's like the complexity of your decision making. Sometimes there are selfish reasons, but those selfish reasons are for the betterment of others.
Yeah. I think the egoic mind wants really clean-cut answers, black or white. But really, I mean, we use the yin-yang, we use spectrum kind of probabilistic type analysis quite a lot on this podcast. Rarely things are black and white. It's shades of gray, and you pick the one that is going to forward your purpose, your mission, your core values. So thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So many questions. Where should I ask? What should I ask?
It's funny because we barely would make it to 45 minutes, and here we are at minute 45, and you're like, I have so many questions.
Yeah, I still have so many questions. Well, I mean, do you mind staying a little longer, or are we?
Not at all. Not at all. I'm more than happy to stay on.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. So in terms of right, so I want to get to a sort of a completion point to, in terms of sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm.
So my assertion is when you are acting beyond your sphere of influence, it's very frustrating, it's daunting, it's challenging, right? At the same time, you want to.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your experience in working with Creative Commons, open collaboration, do you have a rubric, like a tactic or a mental model to help someone to say, hey, I do care about the global community. At the same time, I'm also limited with my resources. What part should I act upon? Should I just?
Well, I would say I'm probably not the best person to answer that because, obviously economically it's not worked out in my favor many times where I've just ended up like, but I feel like compared to a lot of people's stories, I've lived a lifetime every 5 years, right? The experiences I've had and the places I've been and the opportunities I've had have been really remarkable and incredible. Have I been able to put that all in a bank and being able to like buy houses and buy like I don't own a car, right? In a month or so, I won't have an apartment. The homeless humanitarian, and but what that time has taught me, what the last 20 years has taught me, is to figure out what is the thing that I actually want to make that is like, which taps into the ideals of open source and the ideals of collaboration, but also allows there to be kind of some sort of economic engine to allow me to have security. So, I feel like, and we talked a little bit about this, private.
Uh-oh. Problem with recording it in a while. Cameron, are you still there? Can you hear us? Hello? Cameron, can you hear us? Well, folks, looks like Cameron is off his internet connection for the moment. Let's see if he'll come back. Let's hope he will. So if you actually have any specific questions that you have for Cameron, please enter in the comment area so that way we know we can guide the question to a specific thing that you wanted to do or challenges that you have. Otherwise, I'll continue on with our inquiry about what it takes to be a humanitarian, social philanthropist, a social entrepreneur. Okay. And let me know what kind of value you're getting from our conversation so far. I'd love to hear what you think of it. Thank you, Matt, for sharing your thoughts. Hi, Chelsea. Thank you for visiting. Appreciate it. Yeah. What are you guys getting out of hearing Cameron's story? Is there anything surprising that you didn't know about him, didn't know about how he thinks? Please let us know that. I mean, I'm personally very fascinated about what he's learned the last 20 years regarding forwarding his purpose in life, with this type of open collaboration model in tackling very complicated societal issues. as you had talked about earlier, architecture requires multiple players. It's complicated, it's complex, and and local situations requires local solutions, right? So often you need to work with engineers, designers, people in government, people in policy, local investors, and it's extremely complicated. So most people would find that very, very daunting. And I'm curious to know if Z has come up with any useful framework for us to think more globally. So if you have any specific questions about that, do let us know. Let me just double check Facebook, see if he's back. Thank you, Ashley. Absolutely. For sure. I think part of the reason why I talked about it's really challenging to be a healer, to be a therapist, to be a doctor, to be a nurse, to be a teacher, to be a humanitarian, because oftentimes, our higher self wants to give so much. And at the same time, it's very challenging a lot of times for those people to take care of themselves first. So I love that. Put on your oxygen mask on first, such that you can be your best self when you do help. I think one of the most challenging things as people who do want to help is they operate from a place of not having that well-being taken care of. And when you don't have that well-being taken care of, naturally you come out to be a little bit more irritable, a little bit more resigned, a little bit more down, because you physically or mentally or creatively, emotionally, spiritually even, you're just not operate from a place of fullness, right? So I think that point of self-care first is very, very important. Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate it. Well, folks, thank you for being here. Let's see if I can get Cameron back for our part 2 of this conversation. So that way we can make sure that he tells his story fully and we can learn from what he learned from the inception as well as the completion of Architecture for Humanity, because I think there's so many stories and lessons that can be shared with that. What does some of the potential question I want to share with y'all that I was going to ask is, what are some of the new technologies or new platforms or new ideas as a way to better make the kind of impact that we want to make? I think that's a really interesting question to ask. And what does it actually take to be committed to one's purpose? Because if you look at what Cameron did in his entire career, he's been very consistent and persistent and committed to what his purpose is, which is to help the most vulnerable population, the 99% of the world, right? He's usually one of the first to jump into places like that to help. So with that said, what are new platforms or technologies or ideas or alliances could you use to help make the kind of impact that you want to make in the world? I think that would be a really interesting question to ask him. Yeah. So with that said, thank you so much for being here. Let's stop here, and then I'll continue on with a part 2 interview with Mr. Cameron Sinclair. Thank you so much for being here. Love to hear what you got out of this conversation. Love to know what else you want to know from Cameron, so that way we can make sure that you get so much value out of this in helping creating and scaling your purpose-driven organization. All right. Have a beautiful rest of the day. Take care.